Hello and welcome to the 12 Angry Men movie summary. An 18-year-old boy from a slum goes on trial in a courtroom in New York City for allegedly killing his father with a knife. A judge who is clearly bored orders the jury to decide whether the boy is guilty of murder after hearing the final closing arguments. They must declare him not guilty if there is even a remote possibility of wrongdoing. The judge also warns them that a guilty verdict carries an automatic death sentence. Before beginning their deliberations, the jury retreats to a secluded room where they spend some time getting to know one another. With the exception of Juror 8, Henry Fonda, who cast the lone not guilty vote in a preliminary count, it is instantly clear that the jurors have already reached a consensus that the youngster is guilty and that they intend to deliver their decision without deliberation. He explains that the stakes are too high for him to accept the decision without at least discussing it. Juror 7, Jack Warden, who has tickets to a baseball game that evening, and Juror 10 are particularly annoyed by his vote, Ed Begley Sr., who thinks people from slum backgrounds are crazy, violent, and liars. The rest of the movie focuses on how difficult it was for the jury to come to a unanimous decision. Juror 8 contends that the evidence in the case is circumstantial and that the youngster deserves a fair trial, despite the fact that several of the jurors have personal biases. He casts doubt on the veracity and dependability of the only two witnesses to the crime, the rareness of the murder weapon, a common switchblade that he has an exact duplicate of, and the murky circumstances in general. He continues by saying that he cannot vote guilty in good faith if he has a reasonable question about the boy's culpability. Juror 8 grudgingly concedes that his attempts to persuade the other jurors to support his arguments have only resulted in hanging the jury after arguing various issues in vain. Instead, he asks for another vote, but this time it will be done secretly. He suggests that if the other 11 jurors still reach a unanimous verdict of guilty, he will refrain from casting a vote and accept their verdict. There is a new not guilty vote once the secret ballot is cast. Juror 3, Lee J. Cobb, is extremely critical of this and outright accuses Juror 5, Jack Klugman, who grew up in a slum, of switching sides out of pity for the slum kids. Juror 9, Joseph Sweeney, however, reveals that he altered his vote. Felt that the arguments made by Juror 8 merit further examination. Juror 8 makes a strong case that the elderly man who testified that he heard the boy yell "I'm going to kill you" just before the murder could not have heard the voices as clearly as he had claimed because an elevated train was passing by at the time, and that "I'm going to kill you" is frequently used by people who do not mean it literally. Juror 5 switches to a not guilty verdict. Immediately after, Juror 11, George Voskovic, queries whether it is reasonable to assume the defendant would have left the scene after cleaning the knife of fingerprints but leaving it there. And after leaving it in his father's chest, returned 3 hours later to get it. Then, Juror 11 changes his mind. After that, Juror 8 brings up the man's second claim, that he ran to his apartment door after hearing the father's body strike the floor and saw the defendant leave the building via his front door in less than 15 seconds. Because the witness in question had a stroke that affected his ability to walk, Jurors 5, 6, and 8 doubt whether this is accurate. The jury concludes after an experiment that the witness would not have arrived at the door in time to really observe the murderer leaving. Juror 8 comes to the conclusion. The witness must have simply believed it was the defendant running based on what he claims to have heard previously. Juror 3, growing more frustrated throughout the procedure, explodes in a rant, "He's got to burn. We can't keep him in our grasp." Asserting that he is a sadist and a self-appointed public avenger who wants the defendant to die for reasons other than the truth, Juror 8 calls him out. Juror 3 charges towards Juror 8 while yelling "I'll murder him," but is stopped by Jurors 5 and 7. "You don't really mean you'll kill me, do you?" Juror 8 responds coolly, demonstrating his earlier argument. In order to tie the vote at 6-6, Jurors 2, John Fiedler, and 6, Edward Binns, also choose to vote not guilty. The baseball game for which Juror 7 has tickets is presumably postponed shortly after, allowing him to relax and pay attention now that the strain of his busy schedule is gone. Juror 4, E.G. Marshall, has maintained his disbelief in the youngster's alibi, which was that he was at the movies with some friends when the murder was committed, because the boy was unable to recall the name of the film he had seen when he was questioned by police immediately after the crime. Juror 8 challenges Juror 4's ability to recall the events of the preceding days and discusses how being emotionally stressed might cause one to forget certain things. Juror 4 recalls the events of the previous 5 days with moderate difficulty, while Juror 8 notes that he was not experiencing emotional stress at the time. Therefore, there was no justification for assuming that the youngster would be able to recall the specifics of the movie he claimed to have seen. Juror 2 questions the prosecution's assertion that the defendant, who stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, was able to stab his father, who was 6 feet 2 inches, in the downward direction. To test the theory that a shorter person can stab downward into a taller person, jurors 3 and 8 do an experiment. The experiment establishes the likelihood, but Juror 5 then claims that he grew up in an area where there were frequent knife fights and confirms it by correctly using a switchblade. Because the grip would have been difficult and switching hands would have taken too long, no one taller than his opponent would have wielded a switchblade in such a way as to stab downward. Instead, a person who was that much shorter than his opponent would thrust upwards and underhanded. Several of the jurors are now more certain than before that the defendant is innocent as a result of this information. Juror 7 becomes impatient and switches his vote in order for the discussion to be over, which enrages jurors 3 and 11, who were on different sides of the debate. Juror 7 eventually acknowledges that he now genuinely believes the defendant is innocent after being pressed hard about using his vote carelessly by Juror 11, an immigrant who has frequently expressed a strong sense of patriotic pride. Jurors 12, Robert Weber, and the jury foreman, Martin Balsam, are the next jurors to change their votes, making the final result 9-3 and leaving just jurors 3, 4, and 10 as the only dissenters. Juror 10 becomes furious at the way the proceedings have been handled and rants about how slum dwellers cannot be trusted and are no better than animals that cheerfully kill each other for entertainment. Juror 5 turns his back to him after being offended by his speech, and the rest of the jury members follow suit. Juror 10 continues in a voice that is gradually diminishing and in a manner that is becoming increasingly halting. Confused and troubled by this response to his tirade, pay attention to what I have to say. Listen. Juror 4. The lone man still facing him replies curtly, I have. Don't speak again until you sit down. Juror 8 speaks softly about the perils of prejudice as Juror 10 moves to sit in a corner by himself. The other jurors then gently take their seats again. Juror 4 asserts his conviction that, in spite of all the other evidence that has been contested, the fact remains that the woman who witnessed the murder from her bedroom window across the street, through the passing train, still stands as strong evidence when asked why those who are still in favor of a guilty vote still maintain that there is no reasonable doubt. Juror 12 changes his vote back to guilty after he makes this observation, making the result 8-4. Then, Juror 9 notices that, like Juror 4, the woman who purportedly witnessed the murder had impressions in the sides of her nose that she scratched, indicating that she had spectacles but did not wear them to court out of vanity. Juror 4 was rubbing his nose because his eyeglasses were irritating it. When cleverly questioned by Juror 8 about whether or not he wears his glasses to sleep, Juror 4 replies that no one else does. Thus, Juror 8 argues there was no rational basis to anticipate that the witness would wear her glasses while attempting to fall asleep. He further notes that based on her own testimony, the incident happened too quickly for her to put them on. Jurors 12, 10, and 4 all shift their votes to not guilty after he makes this point. Juror 3 is the sole member of the jury that still voted guilty at this time. Juror 3 makes a protracted series of progressively tortured arguments before concluding, "Rotten youngsters, you work your life out." The fact that his relationship with his own son is extremely strained and his anger over this fact is the primary reason he wants the defendant to be found guilty builds on a more emotionally ambivalent earlier admission. Finally losing it, juror number 3 tears up a picture of himself and his son, changes his vote to not guilty, and the verdict becomes unanimous. Juror 8 shows compassion by assisting the upset Juror 3 with his coat as the jurors leave the room. When the amiable jurors 8, Mr. Davis, and 9, Mr. McCardle, switch names at the conclusion of the movie, all of the jurors depart the courthouse steps to return to their separate lives, never to cross paths again. A summary of the movie The 12 Angry Men was provided. Enjoy your day and never forget to like, share, and follow.